Welcome back to another episode of Novelio. Today is Wednesday, May 19th, 2021. I'm going to continue on with my reading of Hot Winter Sun by Jessica Russell. Jennifer pulled the deep emerald-colored dress from its tissue and spread it on the bed. At that moment, Julian walked past the door. He paused in the hallway, glancing at it. "It's lovely. Is it for dinner tonight?" She nodded. Jennifer and Richard had, at Catherine's request, agreed to stay until the child was born, and an important dinner was underway that night, which the family hoped to obtain information about the progress of Cromwell's army. "I thought perhaps it was a bit too grand so soon after our bereavements, but with this general and the colonel from Ramsgate, I'm surprised you noticed." She looked at him quizzically. "I notice everything these days," he replied as if to himself. "And would that be due to a certain young lady who is recently returned?" "I suppose so," he sighed. "I feel as if I never noticed anything until she pointed out the furious pace at which I live my life. She, on the other hand, sees and feels everything, and I think it has brought her greater happiness than I've ever known, although I thought I had everything." Then a shadow crossed his face, and he looked away as if pondering some mystery. "Julian, I sometimes feel that there is something heavy on your mind. Indeed, I think you have begun to speak to me of it on more than one occasion, and then decided not. Am I right?" "Let's go for a short ride, if you're finished here," was his reply. "Yes, I am. Rose will do whatever touches must be completed on this rather extravagant costume, so I will meet you shortly in the stables." Later, as they went at a leisurely pace through the meadows, Julian rehearsed the infamous scene of Catherine and the man she had met. He shook his head. "I do not understand, since knowing her as I do now. I realized it was not some romantic entanglement during her marriage to Robert, and yet she had to have been meeting him for some reason, and he was obviously more than an acquaintance. Oh, Julian, I think you have made something insignificant into more than it is. There could be many different explanations for such a meeting. It may have been a faithful friend or a servant from a neighboring estate who came to deliver a message that she didn't want to risk her father knowing about, and therefore chose a clandestine location for its delivery. The quick embrace you saw may have just been her expression of gratitude, or it may have been a relative no one knew about whom she was meeting in secret for some reason. If you were determined to make it into something romantic, it could have also been an old admirer who wanted one last encounter before going off to perform war duties. People do those things, you know. They want one last moment with someone they loved, or one last goodbye. You see, in a few simple moments, I thought of several things, completely banal, that it could have brought her to meet this fellow in the woods. Are you concerned that a former lover may be coming back to claim her? I suppose I would be lying if I said it didn't cross my mind, although I know she came to Robert, a maid. If there was an old admirer lurking about, it couldn't have been more than calf love, as they call it. Still, I can't deny. I obsess about it from time to time, even now. No, there is no old lover who will reappear. I must ask you to take my word for that." "I suppose I shall, then," Julian sighed. "You could always ask her, you know." "I haven't the nerve," he replied. "I better leave things as they are. Catherine is determined to join us tonight regardless of how she feels. She has such an interest in state affairs. I don't believe I have ever known a woman who was so keen on learning about such things. I find it intriguing. It certainly makes her more interesting to speak to than some women." "I am to assume that some women include Lizette Ashington?" Jennifer asked. Julian smiled at her ruefully, remembering how torturous it always felt to be trapped in company. Another troubling consideration was that Lizette had caught on to his feelings for Catherine, and he did not know what he thought about having her have such knowledge. "You know, of course, of her intentions towards you, do you not?" "And what can I do about that, Jennifer?" "Well, I believe the Ashingtons are of the opinion that the announcement is delayed only because a wedding cannot come soon after 2 funerals, although your friend Paul certainly knows better. Well, thankfully Lizette is at her sister's in London at the moment. And concerning that announcement, they can wait forever, because I'm never going to marry anyone but Catherine. The question is, brother, is Catherine going to marry you?" It was on everyone's mind that night that there may be fewer such gatherings as households slowly but surely made plans to refugee to France. "I don't wish to be seen as a defeatist, but it seems there is little hope that the Cavaliers will win," Catherine said, plainly stating what they were all thinking. They cannot. There is not enough support for King Charles any more, and that is a fact. General Langdon replied. He ignores all the wrong turns he made thus far, so how can he set about to correct them? He firmly clings to this divine right theory even in the face of war. Harold Montgomery said. His father got along all right with it, Carinsa added. Ah, yes, said Harold, but James did not have a Catholic wife. There are some who lay the entire blame of this current war at the feet of Henrietta Maria. Well, I doubt the blame of any war can be laid at the feet of one person, Carinsa said, but the Queen certainly assisted in making things worse and did nothing to help. She was hotly angered because part of her marriage agreement read that she was to have the children's religious instruction until they were 13, and this was not honored, Harold said, which further emphasizes that this war is not only political in nature, but religious as well as most wars are. The bitter feuds are not only between the Royalists and the Puritans, but also Royalists against their own king, as he seems intent on allowing his wife to try to take us back to Rome, Carinsa said. Everyone agreed, but both Catherine and Jennifer exchanged a glance, as if agreeing with something that was not said out loud. Lately they had noticed that Harold seemed to always direct his statements and questions to Carinsa, and to their surprise, Carinsa seemed eager to respond and show that she knew of such matters. They had discussed that perhaps she was finally leaving off her retiring attitude, and it was likely due to Harold and the attention he had been giving her. It was ludicrous from the beginning. Did they believe for a second that the country would allow their future heir to the throne to be raised a Catholic? Said General Langdon. Did she try to enforce it? Asked Jennifer. Of course, said Catherine. She was overly forceful with numerous things, and far too much was done to placate her. I thought the betrothal of the Princess Mary to a Protestant would have helped, said Jennifer. So did I, Carinsa replied. That must have been viewed favorably by his subjects at large. Nay, 'twas done too late, General Langdon said. Only if he had called back Parliament years ago could he have saved himself. The influence of his father in his life was too great, Catherine said quietly. Julian studied her face as he loved to in the candlelight. He knew she was thinking of her own father. He hated any topic that made her sad. Yet at the same time he was proud of her intellect, and was glad it was not wasted on just the family that night. He laughed inwardly at his proprietary behavior. Oh, Robert, forgive me for falling in love with your wife, but I'm helpless against her. It seems the whole of his life he's been influenced by someone, said Julian at length. I should not rule that way if it were me, with others constantly telling me what to do. Who would dare, replied Paul, and everybody laughed. Maybe it is not the fact that he can be influenced, but rather the problem is those who are doing the influencing. Catherine said, everyone, even kings, are not above advice. However, he listens to his wife and others who seem determined to have their way, no matter what it means for country. Yet he will not hear proper advice that would actually help him. Here is a wise young lady, said Paul, and turning to Catherine said, the last time he listened to anyone, I think, was when he brought back the Long Parliament in November 1640, which fast led to high treason impeachment against the leading councillors, said Harold. Among whom was Strafford, replied Carinsa. Ah, yes, the king's favourite adviser, Harold replied. Yes, Colonel Longfellow said how he loved Strafford. When the Scots encroached on English soil and took part of the northern England under their control, it was Strafford who eagerly recommended all kings of unwelcome methods, such as commissioning an Irish army, foreign loans, and the debasement of coinage. The king and Strafford worked tirelessly on these highly unpopular ideas. Not surprisingly, Strafford was the principal target when the Triennial Act was passed, and Parliament was called. John Pym and his allies declared his guilt and pronounced a death sentence almost immediately. I remember hearing about that from our mother the year it happened, Clarissa said. The king promised Strafford that he would not permit his execution, but changed his mind and signed the death warrant. Strafford's last words were, do not put your trust in princes, the colonel said. It grieved the king greatly according to those around him, but he had no alternative. He would have likely been disposed then and there if he'd refused. I think it has become difficult to tell our enemies are at this point, Jennifer said. The country is split, said the colonel. Here in Cornwall and in Wales, as well as some areas of the north and the west, are still primarily for the king, but the manufacturing districts in the southeast across the Tamar are for the Parliament. Look where we are now. Who would have believed it, said Harold suddenly. We have everything in our favour at one point. The Parliament army had no formal training and couldn't stand up to the king's disciplined forces. They were armed with nothing more than their radical Puritan beliefs that God would bring them to victory. And now look how that has changed. It's difficult to understand why it all has to happen, said Clarissa. I know the king acted in a foolish manner, and I know that he is stubborn, and if he is to save himself, must be brought to see reason. But I also do not wish to see England ruled by men like my father, who think pleasure is sinful. You are looking at both sides of the argument, Carinza said, as one should. Catherine could not help but notice that Carinza had glanced at Harold again as she spoke, as if hoping for approval, and seemed happy when he nodded in her direction. It was Oliver Cromwell who helped make the Parliamentarian army such a formidable foe, Jennifer said. Yes, he joined the rebels' army as a captain, Richard said, and reorganized it, apparently understanding that it couldn't be a raggle-taggle mob of men with no skills or weapons. By all accounts and reports, Cromwell is a man to be reckoned with. Earlier this year, around the time Catherine returned, Cromwell convinced Parliament to fund the new model army, which may give the Roundheads their eventual victory. Why are they so named? Because of their hair? Clarissa asked, and the adults were amused at her observation. Julian laughed and said, Actually, yes. They were so named during an attack of court of officers who circled Whitehall. During one such demonstration, the term Roundhead was apparently created. An officer reportedly drew his sword toward the mob and exclaimed that he would cut the throats of those round-headed dogs who barked against the bishops. Then the conversation turned to other matters, and eventually the guests departed, and the family retired to a welcomed, if not somewhat restless sleep. Lisette had invited herself to the Bradshaws for a visit some weeks later, having recently returned from London. Janet showed her in, trying to hide her smile, as she knew that Lisette was unaware that Catherine had returned. Upon entering the drawing room, she virtually froze. Why, Catherine, she stammered. I had no idea. Her sentence was left unfinished as she took in the complete picture, realizing, of course, that Catherine was heavily pregnant. Yes, Julian said with just the slightest touch of malice. Catherine has returned to us. Is that not wonderful? Lisette, quickly regaining her composure, ignored Julian and turned to Catherine, saying, You look well. Have you just arrived? No, Catherine replied. I've been here for several months, but unfortunately I contracted a fever during my journey back and was ill until recently. This is actually the first time I've been quite up and around, and I must admit it feels heavenly. She might have been discussing the weather. She sounded so unruffled. Rarely did anything ever discompose Catherine, and Julian could not conceal a smile at her smooth and ordinary answer to what was obviously Lisette's shock and irritation. He knew that servants' gossip had carried it to Lisette that Catherine was gone forever, and she hadn't been home long enough to hear otherwise. She wasted no time coming to see me, though, Julian thought. I'm glad you are doing well, Lisette said warmly, but even as Catherine responded, she watched her expression, and it seemed the look in her eyes was outright murderous. This woman truly hates me. Later, when Catherine, a bit fatigued at Lisette's chatter, had excused herself, Lisette boldly turned to Julian and asked, How did she manage to get herself into trouble? Would the man not marry her who was responsible for her condition? Lisette, that is enough, Julian said, slamming his hand down on the table. I'm already fit to do you a mischief for the rude way you treat her, subtle as you are, but this type of conversation won't be tolerated in my home. Soon you won't be welcome back here if you do not straighten yourself up. I'll leave you to find your own way out. With that, he stormed down the hall. Less than 2 months later, in early July, Catherine's pains began. Sudden and severe. Richard was nearby at the time and sent for the doctor. It was not long before Julian came roaring into the parlor, demanding to know where the doctor was and if the child was born. Oscar and his wife are with her now, Carinza replied. He was called immediately. Well, where was I? He demanded. You say ridiculous things, Julian. How on earth should anyone in the household know exactly where you were when Catherine's pains began? Now calm yourself, because babies are not born in an instant, and she's only been abed for an hour. At length, Dr. Lincroft made his way to the winter parlor. It was anything but an easy delivery. Nevertheless, she has given birth to a healthy, robust boy. What of Catherine? Asked Julian impatiently. Well, it is virtually impossible to make predictions. I don't believe she will necessarily die, but I do have concern for her health. You are saying everything and nothing, he replied angrily. I beg your pardon, sir, but I have no way to predict if or how fast she will recover. She is weak and needs careful nursing and above all rest. She is almost as weak as when she first came here, and you know how it was then. How much sleep and quiet she needed to fully recover. This is somewhat similar, except that she had good care up until the delivery, whereas before she was in a weakened state that allowed for a fever to take a firm hold. For which I will never forgive her, Julian said. Julian, Jennifer exclaimed, you're talking as if she left here and got sick for the sole purpose of irritating you. When will you realize everything is not about you? People act for their own reasons, whether it pleases you or not. And in this particular case, do you forget the role you played in her decision to leave? Only the devil would remind me of that now, replied Julian with venom. Well, only the devil would speak of unforgiveness at a time like this. She could have died, Jennifer, he shouted, her and her child with her, when all the while she had a home here. She could have chosen to forgive me and stayed. Then when she discovered she was with child, she would already have been here to receive proper care. Instead, she has come to this harm and may yet die, and if that happens, I shall die too. Before his sister could answer, he left the room, and they heard him going into the courtyard. I assume Lord Bradshaw feels a bit more than obliging concern for your late brother's wife, said Dr. Lincroft unceremoniously. You would be correct, Jennifer replied, sinking into a chair. She has come to mean the world to him, and he, being the one who cannot conceal emotion, must rant at the cause of his fear. He blames the whole of this on the fact that she didn't stay before, and of course blamed himself for her departure. However, I understand she's had this tendency toward illness for many years, and even under the best of care may always be at risk. This is true, the doctor replied. The way Catherine rallies the fight you see is merely a tenacious will, nothing more. Physically, she is not a strong woman, and may never be. In spite of it all, with proper care, I don't believe she will die extremely young. I would have told that to your brother, but he prefers talking to listening. Jennifer smiled and said she could not argue. When Julian returned, he waited until his sister and Carissa were otherwise occupied, and then made his way to Catherine's room. Turning the knob and finding it unlocked, he crept in, trying to determine if she was sleeping. However, when she moved, he quickly went over to the bedside and said, I've woken you, haven't I? I'm afraid my sister will send me to Tower Green for this offense. But Catherine smiled at him and reached for his hand, and he sat on the edge of the bed. I am glad you are here, she said. I need something from you. Whatever it is, it's yours, he replied, feeling instantly curious, as she rarely asked for anything. I want my son christened at once, the first thing tomorrow, even though I am not strong enough yet. Can you arrange this? Will the vicar come on such short notice? He will have to deal with me if he does not. But tell me, love, why the urgency? Surely you would rather wait until you can be present. There is plenty of time for the christening. It is in case I die, Julian, although I certainly do not feel ill. In truth, I feel wonderful. But in case it was all too much, and I don't survive, I do not want to leave this world without knowing my child was christened here, and is a true member of the family. Oh, sweetheart, don't ask me to entertain such dark thoughts, he sighed, looking away. I know what Dr. Lincroft said, Julian. He is not sure. He believes that I will live, yet he also leaves room for a scenario where I do not. That can only mean one thing. He doesn't know. If he doesn't, then who can? Please promise to do this for me, Julian, she pleaded with an expression that was almost desperate. It shall be, he said firmly. He asked her if she wanted to call the boy Robert, and she said she did. The next day in the Briarwood Chapel, Catherine's child was christened Robert Justin Bradshaw. Over the days that followed, despite the doctor's concerns, Catherine rallied and was quite well by the end of the first week. She was completely preoccupied with her child and daily celebrated his obvious good health and strength. She was restored practically to the state she was in before Robert's death, and her vigor and energy surprised even the doctor. One morning she thought she heard angry voices outside her door and opened it slightly to see what the trouble was. She discovered it was Sarah and Carissa, clearly involved in some argument. She sighed and was about to close the door, not wanting to eavesdrop, but suddenly realized that they were quarreling over her. You should not be so forward, Lady Bradshaw, and you should address her properly, not as if you are old-school chums, Carissa said with venom. Catherine was aghast and continued to listen. I am always proper with her, Sarah sneered, which is more than I can say for you. You are the one who always treated her disrespectfully. Do you think your pointed remarks went unnoticed last year? Always trying to make sure to remind her of her upbringing and that you are the haughty royalist? How dare you, replied Carintha. You can't deny that you are inferred she didn't belong here. You think it is only you who deserves good things in this life? You have no idea what her childhood was like, how her father preached that one must be miserable to be good. You've never had to live where your own parent was hell-bent on making his family suffer. They didn't even have enough to eat and had to patch their clothes until little was left of the original and watered-down soup till it tasted of nothing. Stitch garments for the poor, who were probably far better off than they were, and kneel for hours in the cold prayer room with no fire even in the heart of winter. Yet you've gladly set her back to those circumstances merely to get her out of here, because you are jealous. You're the jealous one, Sarah, because you are not a member of this family, and I am. That's the heart of your trouble. Instead of being grateful for the esteemed position you've been given, all you do is envy what you can't have. You better take care, or I'll slap your insolent face, Sarah replied, and Catherine wondered if she should make her presence known to stop the situation from escalating. You do, and I'll have you turned out faster than you can say Mayday, Carintha challenged, and all at once Sarah brushed past her and stormed away. Suddenly she heard Jennifer Fry say, I thought I heard shouting. What's going on? Catherine needs quiet. Sarah was acting obnoxious again, Carintha said, and the two walked out of range. Catherine closed the door and stood there for a moment trembling. She could appreciate Sarah's defense of her, but her animosity toward Carintha and the way she spoke to her was not acceptable. Yet Carintha had done nothing to diffuse the situation with her words either. Catherine shook her head in frustration. Those two truly hate each other. Something must be done about it. However, she had other things on her mind, and one night lit a candle and made her way to Julian's study after the household was retired. Are you unwell? He said, rising at once. No, I am all right. I just thought of something I wanted to say to you. Of course, he said, and motioned for her to sit down, which he did as well. Julian, I lay there at night and keep thinking of the time before I left when you tried to make peace with me and apologize. You tried so hard and I was so hateful. I wouldn't forgive you. It was wrong. And here I am at your mercy, and you've been so good to me. You've held none of it against me, even though you have every right to. I would have worked here as a maid if that was what you had wanted. I would have done anything, but you have taken nothing. I don't deserve what you've done for me. This is what you've come to tell me? He asked incredulously. Yes, she replied, looking at him intently. He saw an expression he could not quite recognize, but which quickly disappeared, leaving him puzzled. He leaned over and took her hand in his. But before he could speak, she said, Your father himself asked me not to hold anything against you, Julian. It was when I went to him the last day. He told me to forgive you, and as a Christian woman I could not even keep a promise I made to him as he died. Oh, Kathy, he said, look how I goaded you before Robert's death. And then when I could have redeemed myself after he was gone, I said heinous things. You must have thought me the devil to act as I did. I was afraid of you, she admitted, but I still carry this guilt anyway. I can't shake it. A person should never refuse to forgive someone. It's wrong. You have such a good heart. I understand. I do. But think of my guilt and the words I can never take back. Then looking thoughtful, he said suddenly, Can I be painfully honest with you, Catherine? May I speak from my heart with only the two of us and these walls to hear? You may tell me anything you wish, if you find comfort in doing so, she replied, and he thought again what a gracious person she was. How could he ever thought she was false? I was overcome with jealousy the day Robert came home with you. I wanted you for myself, just as you accused me of back then, he smiled. It's why it made me so angry, but I thought I had plenty of time to apologize for my constant mischief. I would play games and amuse myself, and when I grew bored with it, or you decided to finally tell Robert, he would get angry and we'd argue, but he would ultimately forgive me. You never did tell him, though. He was silent for a moment and then went on. 'Twas a stupid and cruel game which is no longer amusing to me. But at least I can apologize to you. I can never make amends to Robert now. Catherine looked deeply into his eyes, and he was again burning with curiosity to understand the fleeting expression that came and went but said nothing. I think he would have understood, Julian. Robert was gifted. He could easily put himself in others' shoes, as you must know, have growing up with him. You are twins. I am sure it is not so uncommon for twins to be attracted to the same person. You comfort me, Catherine. Even though the excuses you make for me do not hold much weight, I am glad that you make them. It shows you do not hate me anymore. Let us forget what's gone before. We will, she said firmly, and thank you for listening to me, Julian. You're quite welcome, although I believe I did more talking than listening. Oh, I thought I heard someone in here. They looked up and Sarah had appeared in the doorway. Catherine immediately rose and left the room with a nonchalant, "It is only us," in Sarah's direction. She was happy to have her old friend back in her life, but did not relish the idea of servants or others being told of intimate conversations between herself and Julian, and wished that she had not come upon them at that moment. Catherine made her way down the hall to her room, and Sarah bobbed a curtsy to Julian and was about to leave, but he called her back into the room. "I'm glad you were passing by. I wanted to ask you a question regarding the message that was sent for Catherine before she left for France. Was it a messenger with a letter or a verbal message given to you or one of the servants?" Sarah said that he came with a verbal message asking Catherine to come. It was Janet who had summoned Sarah when the messenger arrived, and Sarah had gone immediately to tell Catherine. "All right, then," Julian replied, "but it seemed peculiar to me that anyone would be sending a message asking her to come when her aunt had been deceased for so long." "Yes, I heard that when she arrived it was only to discover that her aunt had died. I assumed that perhaps the messenger had misunderstood what he was to tell her. He did seem hurried and hassled, and I guess that he somehow mixed it up with information for someone else. I did ask Catherine if she wanted me to send someone after him, but she said no." "Could Janet have got it wrong?" Julian asked. "I don't think so, but I could question her if you like. You also said that you had not seen him before." "No, sir, none of us had." "All right, that's all." He searched for traces of deception on her face, but found none, and ultimately had to admit there was no reason Sarah or Janet would lie about such a message. In fact, he remembered that Sarah was always a champion of Catherine's, no doubt feeling an affinity due to their respective backgrounds. Sarah and the other servants were surely not to blame. A few days later he questioned Janet anyway, who was unable to remember what the messenger looked like, and he ultimately decided to let the matter rest. Servants and maids may gossip, but there was just no motive for this grand deception. He sighed. "I must begin looking in another direction for these answers." The next day Lizette showed up with her brother Paul for another impromptu visit. Julian was hoping she would not be as eager to do so after how the last one had ended, and did not understand how she could possibly act so frivolous considering the peril Cornwall would likely soon be in. However, she used the child as a reason to come calling, and with misgivings he left them to converse. After making all the appropriate compliments about the baby and Catherine's obvious good health, he suddenly took the conversation in another direction. "It is so nice to see you, and Julian getting on so well now," Lizette lied, smiling at Catherine. "I know it was far from harmonious in the beginning, and I am glad to see it has all worked out satisfactory for you to come back." Catherine smiled, but did not respond, as she knew full well Lizette wasn't anything but happy about her return, but instead was trying in her not-so-subtle way to glean information about her relationship with Julian. Knowing of his dislike for the woman, Catherine understood Lizette's frustration with what was probably Julian's silence on the matter. Ultimately, the two women spoke of the baby's progress, Clarissa's studies, and what was being planned for the church bazaar, but Lizette was determined not to be directed. "Yes, I must say I am happy that you and Julian have found a way to live harmoniously with each other. Not that I ever thought it was your own fault when it was otherwise. He has some wonderful qualities, but forgiveness and mercy are not among them. He can be very hard on people if he thinks they have done wrong. I remember a man who stole a pheasant once, and he banished him from his living here. It seemed a bit extreme, but then again, that is how he is. If I didn't know him better, I would think it was all an extravagant plot of his to bring down your guard and then execute revenge." Catherine said nothing for a moment. Was that not what she herself had feared? However, she found her visitor positively nauseating, and was disgusted that she would make such a statement about Julian and his own home, even though she had attempted to pass it off as a jocular comment that was not meant to be taken seriously. Catherine yet again changed the topic, determined to do so regardless of how often Lizette continued to make points in which she was not interested. She knew Lizette would soon become frustrated, as Catherine rarely became impatient or discomposed, but rather wore out annoying guests by refusing to be baited into disconcerting dialogue. Lizette's words came back to her later, though, and she wondered if Julian harbored resentment toward her over Robert's death. If indeed Catherine's father was the murderer, was he really a man who would never gave out a second chance then? That certainly hadn't been true in her case. He welcomed her with open arms when she returned. Had he not recently told her that he blamed her for nothing? At length she chose to put the whole matter from her mind and revel in the joy of her child.